Cleverly titled the Safe Streets and Communities Act, and I say it cleverly titled because there is certainly no, and I repeat, no consensus that the proposed changes to the criminal code will make Canada's streets and communities any safer than they already are. This is because this bill relies on the false pretense that increased incarceration rates necessarily lead to lower crime rates. Sadly, when drafting this crime bill, the Conservatives have ignored the evidence. Crime rates in Canada are at a 20-year low. And despite the claim by my Conservative colleagues that there's been a sharp rise in unreported crime, the reality does not reflect their over-the-top rhetoric. Mr. Speaker, the international examples of countries which employ a similar crime model demonstrate why such an approach is not one which Canada should be adopting. Take, for instance, the United States. Since undertaking similar crime policies during Ronald Reagan's tenure as president, federal incarceration rates have skyrocketed, with the prison population nearly doubling over a 15-year period. Yet, in spite of the doubling of the prison population, the overall crime rate in the United States has remained relatively stagnant. This underscores the idea that deterrence through wide-scale incarceration is not an effective crime prevention strategy. If anything, Madam Speaker, it only exacerbates the problem. In the California penal system, inmates are being doubled, sometimes even triple bunked, often in recreational areas of the prison, such as cafeterias and gyms. They also lack adequate access to rehabilitation and mental health treatment, something which has a great effect on the rates of recidivism. Even notable Republican Newt Gingrich has recently reversed course and publicly criticized the U.S. tough-on-crime approach as being counterproductive to the real goal of reducing overall crime rates. Why, then, are the Conservatives leading us down the path which other governments are now beginning to abandon? Madam Speaker, has the abject failure of this approach in the U.S. taught this government nothing? Another aspect of C-10 which worries me is who will be caught in the wide-ranging dragnet of this bill. Of particular concern is the effect this legislation will have on persons with mental health issues and serious drug abuse problems. Under the current system of drug sentencing, judges have discretion when issuing sentences. This means that judges can weigh all factors when determining the appropriate sentence, particularly whether the accused has a mental health issue or substance abuse problem. By removing this judicial discretion from the sentencing process, we are stacking the deck against persons suffering from mental illness and substance abuse. Instead of giving these groups the treatment they need, we will be locking them up in an environment which often fosters and worsens their illness. I've heard from many of my constituents in the riding of Sudbury who have singled out the effects which this bill will have on these vulnerable groups, and they have asked me to oppose this bill for that very reason. Furthermore, although my Conservative colleagues claim that this bill will target serious organized crime groups in Canada, I fear that, as is often the case in the United States, it is the low-hanging fruit that will be caught in the crosshairs. All indications suggest that the vast majority of the people who are going to be affected by the proposed changes are not the Hells Angels, not groups like the Risottos, and ultimately not the people that would generally be defined as organized crime. Instead, the vast majority are small-time, low-threat, non-violent offenders. Should we be really expending finite budgetary resources to incarcerate people who represent very little threat to public safety in Canada? Myself and millions of Canadians believe not, Madam Speaker. For instance, the inclusion of a mandatory minimum sentencing provision for persons caught cultivating more than 5 marijuana plants highlights the failure of this legislation to strike an appropriate balance between public safety and a rational model of crime prevention. I agree that large-scale clandestine grow-up operations are a problem in Canada. It's unfair for homeowners who have unwittingly bought homes that were once used as grow-ups. They need to be protected. But to create a regime where a teenager growing 6 plants in their parents' basement faces the same mandatory minimum jail sentence as organized crime groups involved with large-scale operations fails to properly differentiate between real and perceived threats to public safety. After speaking of real versus perceived threats to public safety, this act would see tougher sentences for persons caught cultivating marijuana than persons convicted of certain sexual offenses against children. Madam Speaker, I'd like to quote Serge Tarkenton. All research in drug policy shows that treatment should be increased, law enforcement decreased, while abolishing mandatory minimums. Madam Speaker, I also take particular issue with the approach of packaging such a large volume of legislative changes to the criminal code into one massive omnibus bill. There are aspects of this bill that I believe are legitimate and useful purposes, but because of the way it's been presented, I'm obliged to vote against it. It seems that the Minister of Justice has taken an all-or-nothing, take-it-or-leave-it approach with this legislation. Either Canadians take the bad with the good, or we get nothing at all. This is not the approach, Madam Speaker, that Canadians expect their elected representatives to take. Canadians expect members of Parliament to have nuanced debates to deal with specific legislative issues. The packaging of 9 pieces of legislation into one bill shortchanges Canadian democracy and makes it impossible for me to support specific changes to the criminal code, which I would support were they introduced individually. I think the fact that a 10-minute speech barely allows me to scratch the surface of this legislation. Madam Speaker, and that speaks to the fact that bundling so many unrelated changes into the criminal code shortchanges Canadians. Finally, something which deeply disturbs me is the fact that the minister responsible has failed to provide Canadians with adequate cost estimates related to the implementation of this bill. Canadians are living in a time of great economic uncertainty, yet the minister is unable to answer even the most basic questions about how much this will cost to implement. It begs the question about how the Conservatives can be trusted to preside over Canada's overall economic prosperity when they can't provide an accurate cost estimate of legislation which they've had in their back pocket for close to 6 years. As an administrator in my past life, Madam Speaker, I understand the need for financial and budgetary transparency. So this leaves me asking a few very important questions. How many new prisons will be required to house the thousands of Canadians that will be criminalized by this legislation? What are the administrative costs associated with prosecuting thousands of additional criminal proceedings? How much of this burden will be borne on the backs of provinces already struggling with budgetary restrictions and tight fiscal situations? Yet, these questions remain unanswered. The fact that the minister cannot provide these basic details creates a broader credibility issue for this government, Madam Speaker. How are Canadians supposed to trust a government which can't provide cost estimates for its own legislation? Does the minister really know the cost, or is this government purposely withholding this information because it knows Canadians will overwhelmingly reject their approach if the real figures were made public? Madam Speaker, Canadians have a right to know the real costs of this legislation. Madam Speaker, in summation, what I see in Bill C-10 is an accumulation of ineffective policies to solve a diminishing problem, all at an unknown cost to the taxpayer. What I do not see is how this bill will actually lower crime and recidivism rates and ultimately make Canada's streets and communities any safer. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments?